This is the year for combating anti-intellectualism by being informed, okay? We are going to know things. Hello everyone, and welcome to 2025. I was going to say happy 2025, but honestly, it's only been 1 month into the year and I feel like I've already lived 4 lifetimes. So I don't know that it's necessarily happy, but it started. Usually at the beginning of every year, I make a video where I create a TBR for myself, usually from my physical TBR of books that I want to read that year that I set as a goal for myself to complete. And usually the number of those books corresponds with the year, so 25 books in 2025 and so on. And I've been doing this for the past 10 years that I've been making videos. This is my 10th year on YouTube, which is crazy. But that aside, this year I wanted to do something a little bit different. As many people say online all the time, we are living through unprecedented times. Although I don't really think that these times are all that unprecedented. I think there is precedent for what we are witnessing and experiencing every day. But the times are scary and difficult nonetheless. So I felt like this year I wanted to try something a little bit different. And instead of picking out 25 books I want to read as a TBR for myself this year, I have made a list of 25 books I think everyone should read in 2025. And I think with the amount of misinformation and propaganda and anti-intellectual talking points that we all see online nowadays, I think it's more important now than ever that we are very intentional with the content we consume, whether that be the news or the movies we watch. I'm not telling anyone that they should stop reading for fun. I think experiencing joy is honestly one of the most important things you can do right now. But I also think that it's incredibly important to educate yourself, to learn some information, to just always be thinking and thinking critically, no matter what you're doing. I think that's just an important skill to have. And I think a lot of these books help encourage that. And in a climate that doesn't want you to think, I think the most important thing you can do is think for yourself. So I have a list here that combines a lot of books that I have read and really love and I recommend, but also some books that I haven't read myself either, but I think it's important for me to read them too. So this kind of doubles as a recommendation list and TBR for you, but also a TBR for me, because I do want to reread the ones I have read and read the ones I've never read. So yeah, you will notice a theme in the list for sure. There's definitely some genres that stick out more than others, but I think there's still a good variety there. But also, if you're looking for new books to discover throughout this year, a great place to do that is through Book of the Month. Book of the Month is an online bookish subscription service that sends a brand new hardcover book to your door every month, and they are kindly sponsoring today's video. Every month they have a curated selection of different books that you can choose from, focusing on debut authors and also some well-established authors, and they have a wide range of different genres, so there's definitely something for everyone. One of my personal favorite things about Book of the Month is their incredible pricing. If you use my code CRUSH, you can get your very first box for just $9.99, which is just such a great price for a brand new hardcover book. In this economy, we could all use it. So if you want to check them out, be sure to check out the link in my description box. Out of their selections for this month, there were 2 that I was really interested in, and the first one is Good Dirt by Charmaine Wilkerson. This book follows the story of our main character who is trying to piece together and solve the crime of her brother's murder, and she ends up discovering a lot about her family and her family history through all that, and it's about grief and family and loss and love, and it sounds really interesting, the type of literary fiction that I'm really into, so I'm excited to try this out. And the next book I'm excited about is First Time Caller by B.K. Borison. This is a romance novel, which I thought would be a fun pick for February. It's a Sleepless in Seattle inspired love story, which I've actually never seen, but I do want to. But it's about a radio host and like this girl who's a hopeless romantic, and they fall in love. So both this book and Good Dirt are available selections for Book of the Month this month, so don't forget to use my code CRUSH to get your first box for just $9.99. So quickly before we get into all of the books, I do want to let you all know that my book club, the Clockwork Reader Book Club, is currently reading Watermoon for our February book. So if you would like to join us and read along with us, the link is in my description box below to join the book club and read this book with us this month. I'm really excited for it. I feel like I'm really gonna love this book, and everyone else seems to be excited too. So be sure to join in and we can all discuss it together. But now, without any further ado, let's get into my 2025 reading list for you. The 25 books I think everyone should read in 2025. Starting off very strong with the first 2 books, we have a series that I think absolutely everyone should read at some point in their life, and I think 2025 is the perfect year to pick this series up because it is set in 2024 and 2025. You could not read it at a more apt time, and that is of course Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. So I have read Parable of the Sower. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I cannot emphasize how good this book is, and I still have not read Parable of the Talents. It's because I want to reread this first before I read this, so I do actually plan to binge read both of these back to back at some point this year, but I have to get to this because I have a feeling I might end up liking this one even more than the first, but who knows? If you don't know what this book is about, it was written in the 1990s, but it takes place in 2024 in America, but America has descended into chaos. The climate crisis is at an all-time high. The government is oppressing all of its people. There is a class and culture war. Everything that could be going wrong is going wrong. Does it sound familiar? And we follow around our main character named Lauren, who is a young girl. I believe she's 15 at the beginning of the book, and she lives in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is on fire. And the story follows Lauren as she begins to essentially create what is her own religion, and people start to follow her. She and the people who end up following her make this trek through California as we witness what is going on in the world around her. There's actually a blurb on the back by Gloria Steinem that says, if there is one thing scarier than a dystopian novel about the future, it's one written in the past that has already begun to come true. This is what makes Parable of the Sower even more impressive than when it was first published. And I couldn't agree more. This book feels like prophecy, honestly. It's just so timely. I think it's such an important read. It is, to me, the best dystopian book I have ever read, and I am so excited to pick up the second one. I've heard fantastic things about this too, and I can't wait to see what this adds to the first book too. Please pick these up, read them this year. There is no better time to start this book series. Next, we have a nonfiction book that I've been wanting to read for quite some time, so this is one I haven't read, and that is An Indigenous People's History of the United States. This book is by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I believe, I haven't read it again, so I don't know that this is exactly what it's alluding to, but from what I can tell, the title alludes to A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which I have read because that was actually my history textbook when I was in high school, which I know is not a common experience. I was very lucky, actually, that I went to a school that was willing to teach me real history for the most part. Some of my teachers really did care to teach us when we were kids, and I learned some pretty valuable information because I learned from some pretty decent books. So I have read A People's History of the United States, but I've never read An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And from what I know about this book, it obviously adds a lot more nuance and context and probably corrects a lot of the falsehoods that are present in that book and gives a more accurate depiction of the true history of this country. I think that I've read some excerpts from it before in like a couple college classes, but I've never actually read the whole thing, and I think it would be worthwhile. So this is a book that I definitely want to check out this year, and I think that if you're into learning about history, which I think all of us should on some level, and in particular the history of the United States, I think that this would be a really great book to check out. The next two books are both by the same author, and they are kind of dystopian, more along the lines of speculative fiction, but how you define it just depends on how you define the genre of dystopian. I think they could fit in either. But the first one is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a book I read last year for the first time, and while it was not what I expected it to be, I wasn't disappointed. For some reason, I was under the impression that this was like a really tragic literary fiction novel that was just going to break my heart into a million pieces and that I would cry. I thought there was like romance in this, and there is some romance in it, don't get me wrong, but it's not lit fic and it's not a romance novel. There is a love story in it, but it is not a love story. Never Let Me Go is really a book about humanity, our connections with one another, and bodily autonomy. That's kind of what the story is about. I don't want to say too much because I don't really want to give anything away, because I think the shock of figuring out what is actually happening is part of the experience of reading this, so I don't actually want to tell you. But it is dark, it's hard to read. This is very much a book about autonomy and who has control over their own life and their own body, and how we are able to still find love and connection and hope in those circumstances. So yeah, it's a beautiful story. I highly recommend it. It's also really disturbing, so just know that before you read it, but it is so worth it. And then the next one is by the same author, and that is Klara and the Sun. This is actually the first book I read by Kazuo Ishiguro before I read Never Let Me Go, and I still think about this book almost every day, even though I read it like 5 years ago or something. This is another speculative fiction dystopian story told from the perspective of an AF, that's I think what they're called in the story. She's essentially an AI robot, and she is purchased to become the companion of this young girl, and the entire story is narrated from her perspective. So you're in her head all the time. And to me, this book is essentially what the movie Her tried to tackle, except I hate the movie Her, and it's 1,000 times better. I also have heard that they are turning this into a movie, which I'm really excited to see what they do with that. I think it could end up being really fantastic, but the book is amazing. It is so thought-provoking, and in a world where we are seeing increasing levels of the use of AI and technology advance to a place that some of us could have never imagined, I feel like it's the perfect time to pick something like this up. It's one of those books that poses a lot of philosophical questions and kind of forces you to sit there and reflect and think, which I just think is so valuable. So I highly, highly recommend this. And I know that it's pretty popular because this is a very popular author, but I don't really hear people talk about it very often anymore, apart from when it first came out and it was super popular. But I think we should continue to have conversations about this book because I just think it's one of the most interesting things I've ever read. Next on my list is another book that I have read and I've recommended 1,000 times at this point, and I'll continue to recommend it. And that is, of course, Babel by R.F. Kuang. You all know it, you've all heard about it 1,000 times from me at least, and also from everyone else on the internet. But if you are looking for the perfect dark academia book that actually tackles the issues within institutions of academia, the racism there, the history of colonialism and imperialism, this is the book. This book does all of those things. And I wish they hadn't gotten rid of the full title on the cover. I think my ARC still says it. Hold on. So the original full title of Babel was Babel or the Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. But now it's just Babel, an Arcane History. That's all this cover says. I think that they should have kept the full title. The theme of the necessity of violence is a major theme in Babel, and it's one that I think we should explore more often, especially in fiction. But nonetheless, cannot recommend this book enough. If you are more of a fantasy reader and you still haven't read this one, it's definitely worth it. Next on my list is kind of just an author that I really want to read this year, but in particular this book because I've just heard countless things about it throughout the years and it's so many people's favorite book of all time. And that is James Baldwin as an author, but in particular Giovanni's Room. James Baldwin is one of those authors that I wish that I had read earlier in my life, but at the same time I know that reading it now, I probably will have more of an appreciation and understanding for his work. Every time I see a quote from any of his work, really, but especially from this one, I just immediately feel compelled to read the story because I know that it's going to be something I really love. Lately, I've just felt compelled to go back and read a lot of classic novels and classic authors, and James Baldwin writing some of the most beloved fiction of all time, I feel like it's important for me to go back and experience his work for myself. So yeah, this one is high on my list and one I absolutely want to get to this year. Next up is a memoir that I have been meaning to read for a couple years now. I bought a copy of this book a little bit ago. I think we can learn so much from memoirs, and I also think they're a great way for people who don't read a lot of nonfiction to start reading more nonfiction. And this is the one that's on my list, and even though I haven't read it, I feel like I can recommend it, but that is What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. This is another one like Giovanni's Room where like whenever I see a quote from this on Tumblr or something, I just have to reblog it because I relate so much, or I just find it so beautifully written, or something about it is just amazing to me. So I just know I'll really like this book. This memoir follows Stephanie Fu's experience being diagnosed with complex PTSD or CPTSD, and it's about trauma and disability and her experiences being from an immigrant family and the specific traumas that come with that. And again, like I said, I just find memoirs so valuable to read because you really get to see a person's experience as honestly as they can portray themselves. And some of the memoirs I've read are some of the best books I've read. So I feel like this is going to be another one that will be on that list. So yeah, in an effort to read some more nonfiction this year for me, and I think for all of us, this would be a good place to start. Speaking of memoirs, another one that is on my list is one that I've actually started, but I just haven't finished it yet. I really do need to because I know I will love this as well, and that is All Boys Aren't Blue. It's a memoir for teens about George M. Johnson's experience of being Black and queer in America. I think it's more important than ever to read books like this right now in a climate that is increasingly hostile and dangerous and just horrific towards the queer community and trans people in particular, especially with books like this one that are getting challenged and banned in schools. I think they're books we need to read and they're books we need to talk about and make available to a larger audience of people. So that is why this is one I want to read. I've had this on my shelf since 2020, maybe since 2019 when they sent me the ARC. The description on the back also says this emotionally raw memoir is perfect for teen fans of I Can't Date Jesus or the movie Moonlight, which I just watched Moonlight recently for the first time and I loved it. That was a great movie. So yeah, I feel like I'm really gonna enjoy this. And again, this is just a book I think is really important that more of us should talk about, even if we haven't read it yet. I think it needs to be visible. All right, so the next 5 books on my list are all a part of the same series, which you might consider that cheating. I literally don't care because I think that this series is so important for everyone to revisit at some point, especially in their adult lives. And also if you're a teen and you still haven't read these, you should. They are more relevant than ever. And also because I feel like so many of us have been influenced by the films and have forgotten the original content of the story. And I think it's important to go back to that from time to time. And that is, of course, the Hunger Games series. Yeah, are you shocked that I'm bringing this up again? First of all, I said 5. There are only 4 here, but I'm adding Sunrise on the Reaping, the new one that comes out that obviously I haven't read, so technically I can't recommend it. But I feel like even if I end up hating it, it's a book that we should read because we need whatever context that adds to this series. So yeah, including Sunrise on the Reaping, I plan to reread all of these this year. Yes, I am making the Hunger Games videos officially. There will be a Sunrise on the Reaping video when that comes out too, but I'm gonna go through each book and we're just gonna deep dive into each one, explore the themes, talk about them. Partially, I'm adding these because I will be rereading each of these. Like I've already just started my Hunger Games reread with like annotations and taking notes and everything now. So if you wanna join me and reread these this year and follow along with the videos that I make for each one, I'd be more than happy to have you. And as I was saying, I do think a lot of people have kind of mixed up what we get from the films with what's actually in here. And as someone who has reread these twice in the last year and is about to reread them again for a 3rd time, I can tell you that if it's been a while since you've revisited this, there's so much more in here that is left out of the films, and there's so much to delve into, so much detail, so much commentary, so many questions that the series asks you as a reader to consider, and themes that you don't often see explored in young adult fiction, young adult dystopian, or even in some adult dystopian novels, honestly. I've said it many times, and people say it online all the time too, that you can't care about fictional characters and not care about people in real life. And I think people sometimes forget that when they read The Hunger Games, and I don't really know why, but I think maybe it's because too many people have just had the influence of the films and haven't gone back to the actual text, because you can't read these and not think about the real world. And I think that's part of why these books have been banned in schools, because they really force you to think critically and to look at the world around you in a genuine way and question things. And that's why I find them so important. So yeah, again, I'll be rereading these this year, including Sunrise on the Reaping. We will discuss them all at length, but I just think everybody should go back and read them again, because I promise you, if you haven't read these since you were a kid, you are in for an entirely new series. Your perspective on them is going to completely change. Speaking of some more dystopian, I have 2 more dystopian books, and these are also both by the same author, and I have read both of them. I recommend one over the other, like I have a preference over which one I actually like more than the other, but I still think that they're both important books to read. And the first one is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This was actually a book I had to read in high school, so I read it a really long time ago, but even from back then, I remember how much of an influence this book had over me. It was, at the time, and to this day still, I think, unlike anything I've ever read, and it is a short but deeply powerful novel. Obviously, one of the most famous books of all time. I'm sure most of you have probably read it, but in case you haven't, or even if you haven't read it in a really long time like me, I think it's a good time to revisit it. I feel like a lot of people will say, oh, we don't need to read dystopian fiction, you need to read nonfiction. And don't get me wrong, I love nonfiction. I mean, I've included a good amount of nonfiction books on this list. I don't think we should ever underestimate the power of fiction. If it wasn't meaningful, they wouldn't be banning these books, and I feel like Animal Farm is a prime example of that. So this is one I really, really want to reread this year, because I feel like I'm gonna have a completely different outlook on it now as an adult than I did as a teenager. And then of course the other George Orwell book is 1984. This one I read as an adult for the first time, and I actually didn't really like this very much when I first read it. I think that personally, at least, there are better dystopian books out there, but just because it's not my personal favorite doesn't mean I don't think it's worth reading. I think there's a lot of worthwhile information in here and a lot of themes he explores that are very thought-provoking and obviously very relevant. So yeah, this is another one where if you read Animal Farm and you want some more Orwellian dystopia, then I think 1984 is worth checking out. Now on to dystopian I haven't read. One of the books that I really want to read, that I've wanted to read for years, and I don't know why I've put it off. I guess I've just never felt the urgency to read it, but lately I have been, and I think this might be one of the next books I read, but that is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I actually don't really know anything about this book other than it's about book burning, so I feel like I'm in for a complete surprise, but it's definitely one of the dystopian classics that I feel like I just want to have have under my belt. So I am excited to check this one out. And if you have read this, let me know. Maybe at some point this year we can read it for my book club, because that would be really fun. Next, I have a couple more nonfiction books that I really want to check out this year that I've heard great things about, and I just feel like they're books, again, I just want to have under my belt and just information I would like to learn more about. And the first one is Braiding Sweetgrass. As the description says, it's a nonfiction novel about the role of indigenous knowledge as an alternative or complementary approach to Western mainstream scientific methodologies. I've heard absolutely nothing but great things about this book, and ever since I first saw it a few years ago and read the description, it just seemed like something that I should read, and I feel like I've just put off reading most nonfiction that interests me for a while now, and I really want to focus on that this year. And this feels like such an important book to pick up now. I think that there's so much valuable knowledge in indigenous communities that we just constantly overlook and constantly brush to the side in favor of Western science, and it's something I don't know enough about and I want to know more about. So I'm really excited to read this, and I really think I'm gonna love it. The next nonfiction book that is on my list is one that honestly I could read anything by this author, but it's this one in particular that is drawing my attention the most, and that is Culture and Imperialism by Edward Said. Edward Said was a Palestinian activist and academic, and he's written countless books, and one of the most famous probably being The Question of Palestine, which I also do want to read. But Culture and Imperialism is one that I have wanted to read as a whole for a while, because I've read, again, excerpts of it for classes before, but I've never actually sat down and read the whole book. That's how I feel about a lot of nonfiction I've read. I've read excerpts of chapters or specific essays that a lot of these authors have written, but I've never sat down and read the entire book from beginning to end. So that's what I would like to do, especially with this one. I love reading books about imperialism. I've always been fascinated by any nonfiction text on imperialism as a concept. I read a lot of it in school, and so I know it's a nonfiction subject that I will find interesting, and I just think it's always relevant and always important to know more. So yeah, that's why this is on my list. This is the year for combating anti-intellectualism by being informed, okay? We are going to know things. We are going to have empathy for others. We are going to be aware of what is going on in our world and what happened in the past and how we got here. Whether you do that through nonfiction or through fiction or through a combination of both, I don't really care. That is up to you. But this is why I wanted to give options and just kind of like a jumping off point. Another author that I actually consider one of my favorite authors of all time, because the work I have read from them I have absolutely loved, but I, again, have never actually sat down and read this book from start to finish, and that is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. I technically could include another book, although it's not a book. I think they've published it in some kind of like small little book, because she actually said this during like a speech, I think. But that's "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." It's a very famous quote. People talk about it all the time. People take it out of context a lot of time and misuse it, but it is one of the most foundational and like life-changing things I ever heard. When I first learned about it and studied it, it changed the way that I analyzed everything. And so Audre Lorde has been so influential in my personal life, and her writing and her theory has like completely shaped the way that I think. So I really do want to read Sister Outsider from start to finish. Honestly, we could include any Audre Lorde book on this list, or just like any essay she's ever written or anything. Doesn't really matter. Sister Outsider is the one that I'd like to start with. Continuing on with my feminist theory recs, because I'm going back to my roots. But next up is a book I've recommended countless times, because it is one of those things that, as I've said with many of these books, everyone should read. Everybody needs to read this at some point in their life, because it will change the way that you approach the world, the way that you look at the world and think about the world, and the way that you look at feminism. Calling yourself a feminist at all is already kind of like a taboo thing, and it has been for a long time. But there are so many different types of feminists at this point that I feel like we are losing the plot. I feel like we are losing the sacred texts, and I consider this one of the sacred foundational texts, and that is Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks. I know that this is like an introductory thing, but I think a lot of us need to be reintroduced to these topics at the very basic, like foundational level. I feel like in the current times that we're living in, going back to the basics is so important. Okay, we need to understand the foundations of something in order to understand it on deeper levels later on. This book really just does give you everything you need to have a basic understanding of intersectional feminism, which to me is the only feminism. If your feminism is not intersectional, it's not feminism. And this book really just gives you a perfect understanding of that at a base level. So yeah, I can't recommend this enough. I want to reread it this year. It's just been a really long time since I've gone back to this, and I feel like I could use a refresher, and I feel like all of us could at any point. So I will never stop recommending this book. And one final feminist theory book that I have to recommend, and then I'll get off my soapbox and you can ignore me. But that is, of course, the one and only classic, Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. Again, another foundational work of feminist theory, always relevant. You will always get something out of this, even if you've read it 100 times. I've read this book at least twice, and I feel like I could benefit from reading it 100 times more. So it's another one I really want to revisit this year, and one that I think, again, everybody needs to read at some point in their life. Okay, the next book on my list is another one that I have read and that I have recommended before, and it's a little bit different than some of the ones that are on this list. As you've noticed, we have a lot of nonfiction, we have a lot of dystopian. This is a literary fiction novel, but I think it is one of the most raw, honest, and important novels I've ever read in my entire life. It's a work of fiction that almost feels like it's not fiction because of how genuine it is and how much you can tell that the author cared about this subject matter, and that is My Dark Vanessa. You're probably wondering why I am recommending a deeply depressing, upsetting literary fiction book. And that is because, similar to why I am recommending a lot of feminist theory, because I just think that's important information for us to have, and it's something I think that people don't expose themselves enough to sometimes. And in particular online, I feel like there has been an upsetting decline in the way that people view women who speak up and speak out about any kind of violence they've experienced, and how society feels the need to have a perfect victim in order to believe said victim. And this is a book that challenges that idea to its very core. This is a book about a very flawed girl who is making very bad decisions, who is a teenager, she's a child, and she's experiencing some of the most horrific things that you could imagine. And you won't like her for a while, okay? She's not a good person, she can be very annoying, she can be very destructive. And none of that takes away from the fact that what happened to her was not her fault. And that, as a concept, is something that I think needs to be ingrained in people's minds and that people need to begin to accept, because the way that people behave when a woman speaks out about something that happened to her, the public reaction to that is extremely concerning. So that's why I'm including this book on this list, because it's something that I think more people need to contend with within themselves. It's a misogyny that's like deep rooted within you that I think people need to unlearn. And I think this book does a really good job of working through some of those themes. That is why, apart from the fact that I just think it's also an exceptional book, despite how disturbing it is, that is why I am including My Dark Vanessa. All right, and then the last two books on my list are a little bit more lighthearted, a little less intense or information heavy, but just as important as everything else on this list. And that is just two books of poetry. Honestly, you can interchange these with any kind of poetry you like. These are just two of my favorites and two that I think have had like a really profound effect on me. And one of them at least is one that I think is underrated and more people should read. The other one is pretty well known. But starting off with the more underrated one, that is Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season by Furugh Farrokhzad. She is a Persian poet from the 1960s, I believe, 1950s to 1960s, who tragically died at a very young age. I think she was in her 30s, and her work is very well loved. This is personally one of my favorite poetry collections I've ever read, if not my favorite one. And I just think poetry is so, I know this sounds incredibly cliche, but it's so powerful. There is so much power in just a few words in a simple poem to honestly change people's lives. And I think that we trivialize that sometimes. I think that we downplay that. I think we look at that as like a silly thing to say, but I don't think that it is. And I think that in a world where they are trying to prevent you from connecting with people on an emotional level, poetry is one of the simplest ways to feel empathy for one another. And so I think it's really important to read more of it. Of course, my second recommendation is going to be my other favorite poetry collection, which is Emily Dickinson. This is technically just a selection of her poems, but she's my other favorite poet. I love her work so much. So really any poet you like, I think it's a good time to just pick up some more poetry. I think it's something that's lost some of its mainstream popularity in the last few years at least, and I think we need to bring it back. That is it for my list of 25 books everyone should read in 2025. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that this list was somewhat inspirational for you, or it gave you some good book recs, maybe some things you've never heard of, maybe it re-sparked your interest in going back to an old favorite and rereading something. I think there's so much value in rereading, and I think that it's something that I've stopped doing over the last several years, and I want to get back to doing it. So yeah, this is going to be a year for me where I focus a lot on rereading books and not just reading new things, but I will obviously be doing a combination of both. But yeah, let me know in the comments down below, what book are you most interested in reading or rereading this year? What is your #1 choice? And also let me know if there are any books that are on this list that you would like to read together for my book club. But that is it for this video. So if you'd like to follow me on any of my social media to keep up with what I'm doing, all of my links are in the description box as always, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to see my future uploads. But I will see you all very soon in my next video. Bye!